I started delivering packages in my early 20s because it felt like honest work that didn't ask too many questions. Show up, scan, drive, drop, repeat. I told myself I was buying time, between a half-finished degree and a string of jobs that didn't stick. The truth was I was hiding from decisions. When you're moving all day, it's harder to sit with regret. The courier company was a contractor's contractor. We wore uniforms that looked official from a distance and fell apart up close. We weren't supposed to talk about clients, especially the famous ones. Discretion is part of the service, my manager said. Like it was a virtue instead of a liability. I delivered to mansions, to studios, to nondescript buildings with security doors. Most of the time, the packages were boring. Clothes, supplements, gifts sent by people who didn't want to show up themselves. You get used to the idea that money can move without a face attached. Then, one Friday night, I got an assignment marked priority, with an address that made my stomach tighten before I even recognized why. The address wasn't labeled as anyone's name. It never is. But it was a known one, a property that showed up in gossip sites and drone footage compilations. The kind of place where the gate has a gate and the driveway has its own turn. The order was strange in how ordinary it looked. A sealed paper bag from a high-end restaurant, plus a small box with an electronics retailer's logo. Dinner and something expensive but unromantic. I didn't know what the box was, and I wasn't supposed to care. At the gate, a guard checked my ID, my badge, my face. He didn't smile. He made me wait while he called someone. The intercom hissed and clicked. Finally, the gate slid open, silent as a threat. I drove in slowly, feeling out of place in my dented van. I told myself not to stare. I stared anyway. Near the front entrance, another guard met me and took the bag. He was about to take the box too when a voice behind him said, "Nah, bring that inside." The voice was familiar in the way a voice can be familiar without ever having belonged to your life. Drake was standing in the foyer like he'd stepped out of a screen and forgot to put the distance back on. He wasn't dressed like a caricature of celebrity. Just sweatpants, a hoodie, clean sneakers. Tired eyes. The kind of tired that money doesn't cancel. I know how it sounds. People think celebrities glow or smell like cologne or have an aura. Mostly they look like people who live under surveillance. He nodded at me, casual, and held out a hand for the box. I handed it over. My hands didn't shake, which surprised me. I'd been around enough wealthy clients to understand that awe is a kind of surrender. I didn't want to surrender. "Appreciate you," he said, and it was the sort of line he'd said 1,000 times. Then he looked at my name tag. "Marcus." "Yes, sir," I said, immediately hating myself for the sir. He gave a small, tired half-smile. "You good out there?" he asked. It wasn't a deep question. It was probably automatic. But it hit me in a place I wasn't protecting. "I'm fine," I said. He nodded like he'd heard "fine" from everyone in every room. Then he turned slightly, opened the electronics box, checked something inside, and shut it again. He glanced toward the staircase as if he was waiting for someone, then looked back at me. "Hold up," he said, and walked to a table near the entryway. He came back with an envelope. Plain, cream-colored, no logo. He held it out with 2 fingers like it weighed nothing. "This is for you," he said. I stared at it. My first thought was it was a tip. Celebrities tip big sometimes. It's part generosity, part performance, part insurance. "I can't," I started, because our policy was no cash tips over a certain amount, and also because accepting anything from a high-profile client felt like stepping into a story where I didn't control the ending. He cut me off gently. "It's not what you think," he said. "Just take it." The guard by the door watched us with a blank face that suggested rules existed but could be bent. I took the envelope. It was thicker than a normal tip envelope. Not heavy like a brick of cash, but not a folded 20 either. "Thank you," I said, because manners are a reflex when you don't know what else to do. He nodded once, already moving away. "Be safe, Marcus," he said. And then he was gone up the stairs, swallowed by his own house. I walked back to my van feeling like I'd stolen something even though it had been handed to me. In the driver's seat, before starting the engine, I opened the envelope. Inside was cash. A lot of it. Not a tidy stack of hundreds like in movies, but several thick bundles, banded. And a folded note. My throat tightened. I counted without meaning to. Came to $10,000. The note was short, written in neat block letters, not a signature flourish. "For your time. Don't talk about this. D." That was it. No phone number. No contract. No explanation. Just an instruction. $10,000 was more than a month of my pay at the time. It was rent, it was a car repair, it was a chunk of debt. It was also a problem. Cash like that doesn't show up in a regular person's life without consequences attached. I sat there for a long minute with the envelope open on my lap, feeling my heart beat in my fingertips. My first justification came fast, like my brain had been waiting for practice. He's rich. He won't miss it. He offered it. It's a tip. It's a blessing. Don't be stupid. My second thought was quieter. Don't talk about this. That line didn't feel like generosity. Felt like a warning. I should have reported it. That's the clean story. I should have told my manager. Turned it in. Filed whatever form existed for. Famous client gave me a suspicious amount of cash. But I didn't want clean. I wanted relief. I took the cash home. I hid it in a shoebox in my closet under winter clothes. I told myself I'd decide later what to do. That I just needed a night to think. That I wasn't committing to anything. The next day I paid down a credit card in cash at a branch office, sweating the whole time like the teller could smell guilt. I paid a mechanic who'd been waiting for my money for weeks. I bought groceries without checking the total. I stood in the checkout line and felt, briefly, like a different kind of man. Then I did what I always did with uncomfortable truths. I sealed them up and built my life on top. I didn't tell my girlfriend, Renee. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell anyone. I even avoided telling the story in my own head. I tried to turn it into a non-event. A tip, a weird celebrity moment, a lucky break. But lucky breaks don't usually come with "don't talk about this." 2 weeks later, my manager called me into the office. He didn't offer a chair. He didn't smile. He had that stiff politeness people use when they're trying not to show they're scared. "We got a complaint," he said. "High-profile client. Says one of our drivers behaved unprofessionally." My stomach dropped so hard I felt it in my knees. "What?" I said. He slid a printed form across the desk. No name, just the address. The same one. It said I had lingered, looked into private areas, asked for a photo. None of it was true. I hadn't asked for anything. I hadn't lingered beyond the normal handoff. I hadn't even looked around more than anyone would. "I didn't do that," I said, voice tight. My manager looked at me like he'd already decided what kind of man I was. "They say you did." It was the first real plot turn. The envelope wasn't a gift. It was a leash and someone had just tugged it. I lost my route for a week. Pending review. That meant my hours vanished. Renee noticed the money stress return like a storm cloud. "What's going on?" she asked. I lied badly. I said there was an investigation about a missed delivery. I said it was nothing. Renee didn't look convinced, but she let it go because she was tired too. I considered calling the manager and telling him about the cash, about the note. Then I pictured how that would sound. A courier accusing a superstar of bribery. Even if it was true, it would look like I was trying to save myself with a story nobody would believe. And I had used the money already. That mattered. It made me complicit. So I stayed quiet. The review ended. They reinstated me with a final warning. Like they were doing me a favor. I returned to work feeling smaller. like my life had been nudged off its axis and I'd pretended not to notice. For a while, nothing happened. Weeks passed. The shoebox emptied. The fear dulled. I started to believe the past was buried. Years went by. I left the courier job and got into logistics for a regional company. Nothing glamorous, but it was stable. Renee and I got married. We had a daughter, Lila. Life became the usual grind. Daycare, sick days, mortgage, little arguments about nothing and everything. The Drake envelope became one of those stories you file away because it doesn't fit the identity you're trying to be. I told myself it was a fluke, a weird celebrity moment. I told myself nobody got hurt. Sometimes, late at night, I'd imagine telling Lila when she was older, "Your dad once got tipped 10 grand by Drake." It would sound funny, like a story with no moral. But I never told it. Not because of discretion, but because the note still lived under my skin. Don't talk about this. Then Lila turned 12 and started asking questions about money, about why some kids had things she didn't. She was smart and observant, the kind of kid who can smell evasion. And that's when the past found a way back in, through a form I didn't expect. A producer from a podcast emailed me. The subject line was cheerful. "Quick question about a celebrity delivery." I almost deleted it. I should have deleted it. The producer said they were doing an episode about service workers and celebrity encounters. They'd heard through industry contacts that I once delivered to Drake and had an unusual experience. They wanted to interview me anonymously if I preferred. My throat went dry. Industry contacts. There was no way that story had circulated unless someone wanted it to. I wrote back that I wasn't interested. The producer replied within an hour. "No worries. Just so you know, we've already spoken to someone else who was present." Present. There had been guards. Staff. The house was full of people whose job it was to remember things for him. Then the producer added a line that made my hands shake. They mentioned an envelope. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. This wasn't coincidence. This was a hook. Someone had tossed it into the water and waited to see if I'd bite. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking of my daughter, my wife, my job. How much of my adult life sat on a lie that could be yanked out from under me? The next plot turn came through my job. I was up for a promotion, nothing huge, but enough to matter. My company did background checks for management roles, including financial. Mostly they're looking for fraud, for debt problems that make you risky. A week after the podcast email, HR called me in. "We have a discrepancy," the HR manager said, polite but firm. "There's a report of unreported cash income from years ago." My mouth went numb. "From where?" She slid a file across the table. It was thin, but inside was a photocopy of a note. "For your time. Don't talk about this. D." My vision narrowed. "How did you get that?" I asked, voice rough. She didn't answer directly. "Is this yours?" she asked. "Were you paid off the books?" Paid off the books. That made it sound like I'd done something for the money, not just taken it. "I got a tip," I said. And even as I said it, it sounded childish. HR watched me carefully. "A tip with a non-disclosure instruction," she said. "Do you understand why this concerns us?" I did. Not because the money was morally wrong in the abstract, but because secrecy is a stain. It spreads. It makes people wonder what else you've hidden. I left the meeting feeling like the ground had shifted under my feet again. The same way it had when my manager accused me back then. The past wasn't buried. It had paperwork now. That night, Renee found me sitting in the dark in the living room. She turned on a lamp and said, "What is going on?" I told her. Not with drama. Just the facts, because facts were heavy enough. The delivery, the envelope, the note, the accusation, the way I'd used the money and never spoke of it. Renee listened without interrupting, face tightening in small increments. When I finished, she said quietly, "So you lied to me for years." I didn't. I started, then stopped. Because yes, I had. Not every day. Not with words. But with omission that shaped our life. I thought it was over, I said. Renee looked at me with tired disappointment. You always think it's over when you get away with something, she said. That sentence hit harder than anger would have. It made me see myself as she saw me. A man who solves problems by hiding them and calls it practicality. Lila was asleep upstairs. I thought about what I'd taught her without meaning to. That money can appear. That secrets can buy comfort. That adults don't always tell the truth. I felt guilt shift into something more permanent. Shame. I contacted the podcast producer and asked who their source was. They replied with a smiley face and said, "Can't disclose, but trust me, it's solid. Want to give your side? Give your side." Like I was a character in a story. Like my life was content. I refused again. 2 days later, I received an email from an attorney representing a private client with concerns about reputational harm. They referenced the delivery, the envelope, and warned me against defamatory statements. They attached a draft statement for me to sign. I had received a voluntary gratuity. I had no further knowledge. I would decline all media inquiries. It was an attempt to bury the past officially. Paper over it. Seal it with legal language. For a moment I felt relief. Sign it, shut up, move on. That's what I'd been doing for years anyway. Then I remembered the earlier accusation, the one that had cost me my route. They'd lied about me before. Signing this would place me back under their version of events. I asked the attorney what would happen if I didn't sign. They replied politely, "We'd regret any misunderstandings becoming public." It wasn't a threat with teeth. It was a suggestion of teeth. And somehow that was worse. I tried to find the original manager from the courier company. The company had been bought and renamed twice. My old co-workers scattered. But after a few calls, I got a retired dispatcher on the phone who remembered me. "You're the Drake guy," she said, like it was a nickname. "Did anyone ever say why I got that complaint?" I asked. She laughed once. "Because you weren't supposed to have anything," she said. "Those houses run on control. If you got an envelope, it meant someone inside messed up. Easier to mark you as the problem than admit they slipped." That recontextualized everything. The envelope wasn't just hush money. It was evidence of someone else's mistake, and I'd been the easiest person to hold responsible. "So what do I do now?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. She paused. "You tell the truth," she said. "Not for them. For you. Truth. The thing I'd avoided because it cost more upfront than lies." I thought about my daughter, old enough now to notice tension in the house, to read faces. I thought about how she would judge me later if she learned I'd kept quiet to protect a celebrity instead of protecting my own integrity. But integrity doesn't pay mortgages. That was the old rationalization rising again. Familiar and slick. I didn't become a hero. I didn't go on a crusade. I did something smaller and more humiliating. I met with my company's compliance officer and told them everything in writing with dates and details and the parts that made me look bad. I admitted I'd accepted the cash. I admitted I hadn't reported it. I admitted I'd lied by omission to my wife. The promotion vanished. Quietly. They didn't fire me, but they moved me sideways into a role with less visibility. Risk mitigation, they called it, as if I were a spill to contain. Renee didn't leave, but something between us changed shape. She watched me now, not like a detective, but like someone who has learned your blind spots can become their problem. The podcast episode aired anyway. They didn't name me, but they described a courier and an envelope. People online argued about whether it was real, whether it mattered, whether it was generous or sinister. My daughter overheard kids at school talking about it like gossip. She came home and asked me, "Is that you?" I told her yes. I told her what I did with the money. I told her why I'd kept quiet. She didn't yell. She just looked at me like she was rearranging a picture in her head. Nothing in my life exploded. Nothing got resolved cleanly. The envelope didn't make me rich. It didn't ruin me outright. It did something more ordinary and more lasting. It showed me the cost of taking the easy way when you're young and telling yourself you'll outgrow it later. You don't outgrow it. You just get better at hiding it until your own kid asks you a question you can't dodge and you realize some debts never disappear.